As if to emphasize the fact that the weight of the crown had by now become intolerable, neither of Alexander's two heirs wished to assume it. Constantine, his brother, had renounced all claims to the throne 2 years previously, to the evident anguish of Nicholas, the youngest brother, who attempted to swear allegiance to Constantine, hoping thereby to force him to meet his responsibilities. But when that failed, Nicholas threatened to go abroad and live in exile. Nicholas I, the unwilling, became Tsar at a time which was least propitious for his personal safety. He was a rather taciturn man, abrupt in manner, and as ungainly as Alexander had been graceful. And he was not given to exhausting himself by introspection. He did decide, however, that education was probably the area which needed the most urgent attention, and he was right. But his solution took people by surprise. He decided that from now on, only the upper classes should be educated. To educate the lower orders, he felt, was quite unnecessarily dangerous, so that Alexander's liberal statutes were rescinded. It might have seemed as though Russia was about to take a huge leap backwards, but it was really too late, because Alexander's liberal reforms had already taken root in this epoch of soul-searching, of intense nationalism, and of liberation movements. Now the conspirators were no longer ignorant Cossacks in the wilderness, but intellectuals in smoke-filled salons, a stone's throw away from the palace and the ministries. The great poet Pushkin was educated in a school exclusively for the elite, which only succeeded in producing fledgling revolutionaries. It became a mark of excellence to suffer internal exile, to be sent away to outposts in Siberia or the Caucasus. Pushkin, Lermontov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky were only a few of the many so honored. A group of such men, high-minded yet impractical, most of them still serving officers, attempted a palace revolution with the Guards regiments in favor of Constantine, who had, of course, rejected the throne, seeking thereby to force Nicholas I, now an unwilling monarch, to adopt a liberal constitution. The conspiracy which captured the romantic imagination was a failure. Perhaps it was because it was a failure that it captured the romantic imagination. The decabristi, the so-called Decembrists, were arrested. Their ringleaders, 5 of them, were executed. Others were exiled to Siberia. One in particular, Prince Sergei Trubetskoy, to this house in the town of Irkutsk, to which his young and blameless wife heroically insisted on accompanying him. Well, the presence of these distinguished people greatly accelerated the spread of Siberian intellect and culture. From now on, however, Russia was never without her plotters, nor, of course, without her secret police. There were, of course, many places in Russia where young revolutionaries could gather in order to formulate their plans, especially in the provinces. Many of them are quite young. I better be careful what I say. Ulyanov? He was not known as Lenin yet. I remembered that.
Могу я прежде всего забрать свои вещи?
Go? Where to?
Но ведь вы пришли арестовать меня, не так ли?
No. No.
Тогда откуда вам известно мое имя?
Oh. Well, let's say that acquaintances told me about you. They said that you were a man who should be watched, a man with a great future.
Они мне льстят.
You don't agree with them?
Нет. Пожалуй, нет. Что вы знаете обо мне?
What I know about your brother, Alexander, was...
Саша. Он был для меня в детстве путеводной звездой. Они казнили его, когда ему было 21 год.
Now you're going to follow in his footsteps?
Нет. Не было в мире человека более чуткого, более доброго, более целеустремленного, чем Александр. Но он выбрал путь теоизма. Это не та дорога. Есть другие пути. Учиться законам политической экономии, общественным наукам, работать.
Yes, they told me that you were among the most brilliant students at Kazan University.
Я подал яхтовое прошение об отчислении меня, поскольку пришел к выводу о невозможности дальнейшего обучения в университете в тогдашней обстановке.
Well, what happened then?
Я был арестован и посажен в тюрьму. Никогда в жизни я не встречал там таких замечательных людей. В конце концов, мы все оказались там по одним и тем же мотивам.
What happened after you were released?
Я был сослан в деревню Кокушкино. Да. За целый год я не прочитал такое количество книг, как там. После ссылки в Казанский университет я был допущен, не был. Мне отказали также в разрешении продолжать учебу за границей. И тогда я решил закончить университет экстерном. За 18 месяцев я подготовил 4-годичный курс юридического факультета и сдал его в Санкт-Петербургском университете и получил юридическую практику.
Yes, but that was not the end of your ambitions.
Нет.
Could I know a little more? Oh, please, please. I'm a foreigner.
Что бы мне хотелось? Как можно меньше времени проводить в ссылке, в тюрьме, несмотря на замечательное общество в тамошних местах. А если серьезно, то в конечном счете, благодаря богатству накопленного опыта, богатству знаний, перевернуть существующий капиталистический порядок с его эксплуатацией бедных и обездоленных и установить в стране власть социализма.
Well, that's no mean ambition.
Вы смотрите на меня как на идеалиста, витающего в облаках. Да, это тяжелый путь. У нас будут ошибки. Но даже если мы совершим 10 тысяч ошибок, на каждый верные 100 действий, то и тогда наша революция будет великой и несокрушимой. Потому что впервые простой народ, огромное большинство рабочих и трудящихся будут сами строить новую жизнь, научатся обходиться без капиталистов и пробьют, в конце концов, себе дорогу к победоносному социализму.
Don't you think we should continue our conversation in your room? I mean, You're raising your voice so much on the staircase.
Нет, здесь безопаснее. Если они встретят вас в обществе со мной, вам не поздоровится. Пока что.
Well, I must say, I admire your convictions.
И остаетесь скептиком. Послушайте, друг мой, у меня тоже бывают минуты отдохновения. Я люблю музыку, люблю шахматы. А пансионата – самая любимая вещь моя у Бетховена. Я восхищаюсь всякий раз, когда слушаю ее. И перехожу к банальному, но вечно простому выводу. На какие только чудеса человек не способен.
Yes, I know, but a piece of music and an entire revolution?
И у того, и у другого общие корни. В убежденности и гуманизме. Вы не понимаете, как мы можем победить. А я не понимаю, как мы можем проиграть. В этом вся разница между нами.
Someone climbing the stairs.
Да. Пришло время расходиться в разные стороны.
He did succeed in going abroad eventually. Other revolutionaries were not so fortunate. They stayed in Siberia. Irkutsk was built as a fortress in 1652, and behind me is the church, which was the place of worship for the garrison. But today, it's a city of over 600,000 people, with 4 theaters, a planetarium, a circus, and the inevitable, a huge scientific complex on the outskirts of town. It's not far from the outer Mongolian border, on the Trans-Siberian Railway, which has existed here since 1898, and it's still an important stop on the way between Moscow and Vladivostok. The Trans-Siberian Railway was built with a certain sense of urgency, even if it took a long time to complete. It was intended as a strategic artery with a significance both military and civil. Men could not go on relying on camel and bullock in a rapidly developing world. And until the coming of the aeroplane, here was this miraculous train in which men could sip tea, sleep, and dream as they heedlessly gobbled up the kilometers. They're trying to inform the train that the carriages had been left behind. Today, they can even nip up to Moscow and the ministries and return refreshed. That is where this delegation of local worthies has been. There's no trace of success or failure on their faces, but after all, it was they who taught the Russians inscrutability. This is Lake Baikal, a 2-hour boat trip from the town of Irkutsk in Siberia. And it is the deepest lake on Earth. It is also very unpolluted. In fact, one of the local tricks is to get you to drink water straight from the lake. Delicious. Baikal has over 100 types of different animal and insect species. Over 50 of these exclusive to the lake, and therefore unique. are freshwater sea lions, for instance, and a mysterious link with prehistory, when it is supposed the human species gradually acquired feet and legs and left the steaming swamp and the fetid pool to walk the earth in search of nourishment. The link in question is the oilfish, which produces its young from a womb. Even visually, the sight of Baikal might lead some to suppose that they were in the south of France, some that they were in Switzerland or in the British Channel Islands, others again in the Outer Hebrides, or somewhere in the heart of Quebec. Few would ever guess they were in Siberia. It is one of the few truly mysterious places left on Earth. But Baikal does not have a monopoly of strangeness. Eupatoria in the Crimea may not have freshwater seals, but it does have saltwater swans. And it was here that the British, French, and Turks provoked a conflict with Russia halfway through the 19th century. The British Admiralty decided it was ready for this conflict because it had in its possession a map of the Crimea. Unfortunately, this map did not indicate that the waters around the Perikop Isthmus, where the admirals had ordered the assault, was nowhere deeper than a few feet. This fact was found out on the spot when several of the ships ran aground miles from the shore. The French didn't even have an adequate map. They merely had 2 watercolors done by the French academician Raffet while on holiday at Sebastopol. And these were now removed from the wall of the salon and studied meticulously by the French emperor and his general staff. The British commander and his staff now cruised down the coast aboard HMS Caradoc, looking for a suitable landing place. They observed through their telescopes the Russians, observing them through their telescopes. Both sides doffed their hats courteously at each other, and then the British sent a letter ashore announcing their intention of disembarking. The Russian governor of Eupatoria, which was also in the grip of an epidemic, invited them ashore, but warned them that as soon as they set foot on Russian soil, they must consider themselves in the strictest quarantine. This tone of farce was present relentlessly during the 2 long years of this miserable war. Lord Lucan, at the culmination of the heroic but absurd charge of the Light Brigade, recognized a Russian gunnery officer whom he met socially in Paris, and he reined his horse to ask if the officer had had any recent news of their hostess. Watching this bizarre military operation, the French commander said, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre." It's magnificent, but it's not war. The same might have been said of the entire campaign, except, of course, that so much of it was far from magnifique. Florence Nightingale and the correspondent of the London Times, William Russell, pointed out the scandalous standards of sanitation and other imbecilities, to the point where Russell was accused of being low and groveling by military mouths under their crisp moustaches. Russell's was one of the earliest examples of true investigative reporting. Perhaps the most eloquent symbol of the mood of hopelessness and muddle was the British Commander-in-Chief himself. Lord Raglan was in his 80s. He'd seen no military service since he was Wellington's military secretary at the Battle of Waterloo 40 years previously. And he could never get out of the habit of referring to the enemy as the French. And he became apoplectic when anyone tried to point out his error. Well, the campaign proved nothing, and it cost many lives, although it was hailed in the West as a major victory. Nicholas died, broken by the failure of his pretensions and by God's inexplicable defection on the 22nd of March, 1855. The church behind me was erected in memory of all those who died so uselessly. The city of useless death is today a city of health and convalescence, a city of children's sanatoria. There is a feeling of lightheartedness today on the charming esplanade and the endless sand beaches, a feeling of dedication to physical well-being and peace of mind. The mastery of techniques which would have provoked Peter the Great's ingenuity. And a sense of continuity which causes the saltwater swans to search for sea fish in utter contentment. Alexander II was a thin, stylish man without much personality, but he was affable enough. During his father's reign, there had been as many as 556 separate peasant uprisings, none of them of any national consequence. But the fact that there were so many of them, and that they appeared at such frequent intervals, meant that the temper of the nation could no longer be ignored, especially after the disgrace of the Crimean War. The whole system of serfdom was archaic. The fact it was inhuman didn't worry the establishment unduly, but the fact was that it no longer fulfilled its original purpose, which was that of engendering unquestioned obedience. Now it merely fomented discontent. And it proved to the rest of the world that the Russians were irrevocably behind the times. We're here in a palace built entirely by serf labor. It has consequently in recent years become a serf museum. And Alexander II stayed here on several occasions while he was preparing to make his move. You only have to glance at a place like this to realize that the nobles who lived here and places like them would fight like mad to delay the inevitable day of surrender. Well, they did. They haggled on all of the 46 provincial commissions which were set up in order to pave the way for serf emancipation. They derived certain concessions. The plots of land they gave up to the serfs were slightly smaller. The rents the serfs would have to pay to them when they were free were slightly bigger. But there it stopped. The law became effective on the 9th of February, 1861. On the 10th of February, the very next day, in another distant land, a newer land, divided on the same issues, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as President of the United States. Lincoln, who is revered in Russia today, as he is in his own country. It was through the arts that the West got their first impressions of the new Russia, most especially through literature. It's true that the great poems of Alexander Pushkin had more effect on the Russians than on foreigners, simply because of the difficulty of adequately translating his own subtle style with its insistent rhythms and its irony. Both Pushkin and his brilliant young contemporary Lermontov were killed in duels, a pastime which reached epidemic proportions among the romantic, fatalistic youth of St. Petersburg as a cure for boredom. Russia is in permanent mourning for her illustrious dead, and the residences of great men who may have suffered terribly during their lives become shrines after their deaths, and no questions asked. Russian letters reached their full flowering at the middle of the 19th century, and there were three giants who dominated this period. There was Tolstoy, of course, whom we visited previously, old, cantankerous, charitable, kind, exasperating, full of the pottiness of his dotage, yet with a sense of humor about it, a giant by any standards. Then there was Turgenev. If Tolstoy can be described as the faith healer of the group, Turgenev was the kind, ineffectual family practitioner. He was brought up very badly by an odious mother and consequently wrote a whole series of wan portraits of family life in which there are powerful women and indeterminate men. He is in his way the most national of the three. The three. We've had the family practitioner, the faith healer, now comes the surgeon. Dostoevsky, in whose flat we are at this moment, a writer of undoubted genius and colossal influence, who exploited man's unconscious and conscious motivations to the full depth, perhaps for the first time, setting new standards for compassion and understanding. I must confess I was a little frightened we might find him in, not because I didn't want to meet him, because I just don't know what to say to such a genius. But there's no such luck. There are several half-filled suitcases in the hallway. It looks as if someone's packing, and an unfinished manuscript on the desk. Oh, and here, rather charmingly, we indiscreetly looked at it, a note which I imagine must be from his daughter, which simply says, "Father, I love you, Luba." This is one of those canals beside which Dostoevsky might have walked on a summer evening. Dostoevsky, the first great exploiter of the duality in human nature, the first great prophet of paradox. He used to dictate all his works, which made them even more extraordinary. One might have thought, with his great gift for drama, and not to say melodrama, that he would have written plays instead of books. He had the necessary concision for it, but perhaps it needed the wider canvas of a novel to give his power and his compassion full rein.
Nonsense.
Mr. Dostoevsky?
Это единственное, в чем я уверен твердо.
You don't agree with my assessment of your work?
Ни да, ни нет. Возможно, вы верно оцениваете мое творчество, а может быть, все это чепуха. А то, что я сказал чепуха, не суть важно, это всего лишь мое мнение.
Come, come, you must value your own opinion.
Я вполне естественно ценю свое мнение временами. Но было бы ошибкой считать, что и другие оценят его, как я.
Mr. Dostoevsky, a little time ago you made a speech at the unveiling of a monument to Pushkin. It was a wonderful speech. It was of evident sincerity and colossal power, and you said that Russia's destiny was to revitalize the world by the example of its selflessness and the brotherly love expressed in the Orthodox Church. And people acclaimed you as a prophet, as a saint.
Все, что искренне сейчас, завтра будет подозрительно. Под влиянием момента даже в самых разумных людях может подняться вихрь энтузиазма, который они забудут на следующий же день.
Well, at the risk of shocking you, one might say the same about Jesus Christ or his followers, Peter, doubting Thomas.
Сегодня его последователи такие же люди, что и в те времена. Они готовы поклоняться всякого рода ничтожествам, возомнившим себя пророками. Иисус Христос — единственное постоянство в нашем непостоянном мире. Мы верим в это, потому что нам нужно во что-то верить. Это человеческая необходимость. Человеку необходимо хотя бы в чем-то быть несгибаемым. И ярчайший пример тому Христос.
And on his own level, Dostoevsky.
Теперь вы меня действительно шокируете. Я верю, по крайней мере сейчас, когда отвечаю вам, что только русский народ способен видеть в страдании единственный путь к возможности будущего счастья. Все очищается страданием. За каждый миг счастья необходимо платить монетой горя.
Well, I don't think that's entirely true.
Нет вечных истин. Некоторые вещи вообще неверны.
Mr. Dostoevsky, when you were younger, you were led out into a public square in order to be shot as a revolutionary. In the last moment, there was a reprieve, and you were sentenced to 4 years in Siberia and 8 further years in the army. Don't you sometimes resent those 12 wasted years of your life?
Нет. Они мне дали все. Мою литературу, моих героев, опыт и все мое сострадание. Разве можно обижаться на что-то лишь за внешнюю несправедливость? Поэтому я признателен, даже благодарен крепостям, идиотам, приговорившим меня к расстрелу.
Well, I must say, the speech at the Pushkin Memorial was quite something. That was... But I think, in the light of his opinions about Pushkin, I don't think our friend Tolstoy would even have accepted the invitation to speak there.
Бедный Лев Николаевич. Такой аристократичный, ровный. Он иногда так серьезно пытается выглядеть сумасшедшим, но безуспешно. Он всего лишь чудак. Я же кто и вправду имеет в себе черты безумия, изо всех сил стремлюсь выглядеть нормально, с тем, чтобы меня поняли. Вот вам Россия, мой друг.
Music was another cultural ambassador, which announced to the world that here was a new gold mine to be tapped, a new sensibility to be adjusted to. Here, one of the best orchestral units of the Soviet Union, the Academic Philharmonic Orchestra of Novosibirsk in Siberia, is rehearsing Romeo and Juliet by Tchaikovsky. Under its conductor, Professor Arnold Katz. There are things in Russia which impress a great deal. There are other things which are so grandiloquent, they seem to defeat the object of dignity which they wish to invoke. I'm thinking of certain of their huge memorials. But here, one can find perfection in this line. It's also a place to do with memory, but it's in the open air, under a canopy of trees. It doesn't even attempt solemnity of any sort. It's a place of intimate serenity. And one feels that the many distinguished people buried here still continue with a subterranean colloquy. The Lavra Cemetery in Leningrad, Russia's poet's corner for all the arts. The concentration of talent in this place is absolutely astonishing. Here are the mighty 5 Russian composers, all in a line, starting with Balakirev, then Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, Borodin, César Cui, and a little removed from them in death, as he was in life, is Tchaikovsky himself. And here, facing the musicians, but a little removed from them, aloof and forbidding, Dostoevsky. But he can hardly be said to be lonely now, nor in need of subject matter. This is a really wonderful place. It's like a filling station for the mind. To the music of pictures at an exhibition by Mussorgsky, we come to the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, passing a statue of its founder, to see some of Russia's contribution to the visual arts. Russia was never really known for her painting. That is, of course, until the great post-revolutionary immigration, when people like Chagall and Kandinsky, contemporary figures, integrated themselves loosely into either the French or the German schools, or others who remained independent but clustered around the ballet, such as Bakst, Benoit, Goncharova, Larionov. But there were those who stayed home and who were half hidden in the immensity and self-sufficiency of their mother country. Figures who really deserve to be known internationally. One thinks, for instance, of Repin, whose lifespan covered 86 years. He died in 1930, and he was a consummate master of several techniques. Then there was Serov, my own particular favorite, I admit to that, who developed independently of the French Impressionists, but really had nothing to learn from them. Then there was Vrubel, of course, loaded with symbolism, very typical of his period. And there were others. There were a whole lot of painters who are really completely ignored outside Russia, where they are revered. And of course, the person responsible for this reverence is the one who made this collection possible, with enormous foresight and with an almost fanatical confidence in his own country. I refer, of course, to Mr. Tretyakov himself. The heritage is everywhere in evidence, as ordinary men and women search themselves for shreds of talent. By the shores of Lake Baikal in Siberia, in Moscow's Red Square itself, or by the sunlit banks of the Neva in Leningrad. So revered are the arts that everyone hopes for a fragmentary ration of their own. Nicholas II was another of those Tsars who would rather not have ruled. In fact, of all of them, he was probably the one the most addicted to the quiet life. And so, like the frog in La Fontaine's fable, he had to blow himself up to unnatural proportions in order to assume the unforgiving dimension of autocracy. Let it be known, he said, that I intend to uphold the autocracy as unswervingly as did my father. Nicholas II's father died in his bed, but his grandfather was assassinated, as were many members of the royal entourage, either by bomb or revolver, the most ambitious attempt being when the dining room at the Winter Palace was blown up by a laborer, fortunately between meals. Yes, there was not much peace of mind behind the niceties. Terrorism lurked in the shadows and in the crowds. This was Nicholas II's study, and it has a trick in the roof whereby even a weary, meek, and mild monarch can at moments sound terrible. The Tsar was intrigued by gadgets of all sorts. He made his own home movies, showing a predilection for playful subjects, the rough and tumble of pastoral life, as well as unseasonal summer snowball fights with projectiles of cotton wool, or the hazards of nautical jigs on brine-covered decks. Away from the court circles, that other distant life of ordinary people developed in another way. The popular unrest was fueled by the disaster of the war with Japan and the humiliating peace which was to follow. Student riots spread over the south of Russia. The Minister of Public Education threatened the ringleaders with compulsory military service. He was assassinated by a student. 2 months later, the Minister of the Interior was assassinated in his turn. Those accused of political crimes increased fivefold in 9 years. The slaughter of wolves was not much different to previous years, however. 2 years later, St. Petersburg experienced its first strike in which as many as 30,000 workmen participated. Marxist socialism showed its hand for the first time. Well, the revolutionary crowd, led by the peculiar figure of Father Gapon, who was a revolutionary mystic, a religious zealot, and a police informer all in one. The crowd, carrying icons and other religious symbols, went to the Winter Palace in order to have a conversation with the little father of all the Russias. Well, the Tsar was out. The Cossacks were not. They opened fire on the crowd, and about 1,000 of the crowd were killed. To whom could the populace appeal? The Tsar was always out. Well, one would have thought the Parliament. Oh yes, under pressure in 1905, Russia had acquired its parliament, its Duma. It had only consultative, as opposed to legislative powers, of course. A council of state appointed by the Tsar could accept or reject its suggestions, more usually the latter. Yes, alas, its function was cosmetic. The Duma went on arguing as though its debates made the remotest kind of sense until the morning of January the 9th, 1906, when its members turned up here in the morning before the Tauride Palace, its parliament, in order to indulge in their daily dose of hot air, only to find the palace surrounded by troops, including artillery. The artillery was a gentle hint that the Duma had been suspended and that Russia's first flirtation with popular suffrage was now at an end. However, all was not well with the autocracy either. It was now established in the court that the Tsarevich Alexis, the heir to the throne, was a hemophiliac, a dread disease which he had inherited from his mother's side. Well, they tried every kind of a cure and eventually began to rely upon Rasputin, a huge, unkempt but hypnotic holy man from Russia's medieval past. He had a mysterious and emollient effect on the highly strung boy, which ingratiated him with the court, through which he rampaged with the uninhibited power of a bull set free in a field full of cows, even exerting his influence in the field of politics through the acquiescence of the empress. And this small and increasingly absurd world of the spineless autocrat, the emotional wife, the sick child, and the mad monk who lorded it over a so-called parliament of hamstrung deputies, was saved from total discredit not only by the bayonets of the military or the whips of the Cossacks, but by the fact that the First World War broke out.
Coming up next on Channel 2, Inspector Morse finds more than murder when he investigates his latest case on mystery. Next. Then on Saturday, in the world of international espionage, the only rule is win. Discover the clandestine world of secret intelligence, Saturday night at 9, here on Channel 2.